Hello chess buddies, welcome to Amateur Chess University. Today we'll look into the analysis of a game which featured one of the most legendary chess endings of all time. Now this game was played on July 12, 1912 and it took place between Frank James Marshall, the United States chess champion from 1909 to 1936, a brilliant attacking player, and his opponent was Stefan Levitsky, the Russian chess grandmaster. It was played in the city of Breslau, which is now called Wroclaw, and you surely don't want to miss this match. So without further ado, let's head straight into the game. Stefan here begins the game with d4, going for the queen's pawn opening. Frank replied with e6, going for the Harvard's defense of the queen's pawn opening. Here Stefan pushed his e2 pawn to e4, going for the normal variation of the French defense. And Frank pushed his pawn from d7 to d5. Usually in the modern day games, the players usually prefer to capture the pawn at d5 or bring the knight to d2. But this game was played at a different time period. And here Stefan developed his knight from b1 to c3, which is the third most played move in this position. Here Frank developed his pawn from c7 to c5, going for the Marshall variation of the French defense. The Marshall variation puts the pressure on the d4 pawn, asking for a pawn exchange. And Stefan developed his other knight, bringing it to f3. Now Frank developed his queenside knight, bringing it to c6. And here Stefan captured the pawn on d5. And Frank captured the pawn on d5 with his e6 pawn. Now Stefan developed his light square bishop, bringing it to e2, preparing for castling. And Frank developed his kingside knight, bringing it to f6. Stefan goes for the kingside castling in this position. And Frank developed his dark square bishop, bringing it to e7. Now Stefan brought his dark square bishop to g5. And Frank castles in this position. Here Stefan captures a pawn on c5 with his d4 pawn. Here Frank cannot immediately capture the c5 pawn with his dark square bishop, because his pawn at d5 is exposed to a double attack from the knight as well as the queen. So he brought his light square bishop to e6 first. And now Stefan moved his knight to d4, targeting this light square bishop. Now Frank captured the pawn on c5 with his dark square bishop, and Stefan captured the light square bishop on e6 with his knight. Here Frank captured the knight on e6 with the f7 pawn, and Stefan brought his light square bishop to g4, now targeting the e6 pawn. Here Frank cannot capture the light square bishop because his queen is still pinned. So he first moved his queen to d6, providing support to this pawn at e6. And now the light square bishop is under attack from the knight. So Stefan moved his light square bishop to h3. Here Frank brought his rook from a8 to e8, targeting the e file as well as providing additional support to this pawn at e6. And Stefan moved his queen to d2. Now Frank moved his dark square bishop to b4. Frank's idea was to keep this knight at c3 pinned while bringing his knight from f6 to e4, targeting the queen at d2. Stefan was aware of this, so he captured the knight at f6 with his dark square bishop, and Frank captured the dark square bishop with his rook. While the best option for white in this position was pushing the pawn from a2 to a3, Stefan went for another move. He played his rook from a1 to d1. Now Frank brought his queen from d6 to c5, launching a double attack on this knight at c3, while also targeting this pawn at f2 twice. And here Stefan moved his queen from d2 to e2. Now the dark square bishop captures the knight on c3, and the b2 pawn captures the dark square bishop on c3. Here Frank captured the pawn on c3 with his queen, and Stefan captured the pawn on d5 with his rook. Here Frank cannot capture the rook on d5 with his pawn, because he will also end up losing his rook on e8 while also coming close to check. So here he brought his knight to d4, now targeting the queen on e2, and Stefan moved his queen from e2 to h5, now targeting the rook on e8. Here Frank moved his rook from e8 to f8, doubling up on the f file, and Stefan also saves his rook by bringing it to e5. Here Frank moved his rook from f6 to h6, attacking the queen, and Stefan moved his queen to g5. And in this position, Frank played a spectacular game-changing move. He captured the light square bishop on h3 with his rook. Now what can Stefan do here? He actually cannot capture the rook on h3 with his pawn on g2, because if he does so, then Frank will play his knight to f3, delivering a check while also picking up the queen. So after the rook captures the light square bishop on h3, Stefan moved his rook from e5 to c5, targeting Frank's queen. And it was here that Frank Marshall played one of the most amazing game-ending chess move in history. He played his queen to g3, allowing his queen to be captured by the f2 pawn, h2 pawn, as well as the queen at g5. And it was in this position on move 23 that Stefan Levitsky resigned the game. Marshall insisted later on that this final queen sacrifice move triggered a shower of gold coins from the spectators because they were so impressed with it. So what is so special about this particular move? Well, the pawn at f2, the pawn at h2, as well as the queen at g5 can actually capture this queen at g3. But doing so would actually result in a heavy loss for white. So let's analyze it further. If Stefan captures the queen on g3 with his queen, then Frank will bring his knight to e2, delivering a check. And if the king moves to h1, then Frank will pick up the queen on g3, again delivering a check. Now the problem for Stefan is, he cannot capture the knight on g3 with his pawn on h2, as the h2 pawn is pinned by this rook. He also cannot capture the knight on g3 with his f2 pawn, because if he does so, then it will end up in a checkmate. If Stefan tries to capture the queen on g3 with his f2 pawn, then Frank will bring his knight to e2, delivering a check. Now this will force the king to move to h1, and Frank will complete the checkmate by capturing the rook at f1 with his rook at f8. And if Stefan tries to capture the queen on g3 with his h2 pawn, then Frank will deliver the checkmate by bringing his knight to e2. So that's the game. The ending to this game, played in 1912, is an example of human brilliancy and how far an elite mind can reach to bring out the best, yet an unorthodox idea that can seemingly escape so many humans and engines alike. Hope you enjoyed this game coverage. If you have any thoughts on the game, feel free to share below. Thank you for watching. Take care. See you.